There is something people rarely realize about service. It changes the moment they believe the person in front of them doesn't matter. I learned that lesson a long time ago, and every once in a while, I like to test it. Not from a boardroom, not from a corporate office, but from seat 1A on one of my own airplanes. That night, I booked the ticket quietly under a shortened version of my name. No assistant arranging travel. No executive notification in the system. No message to the airline's management team. Just a printed boarding pass, a small leather briefcase, and a seat in first class like any other passenger. At 67 years old, I've discovered something interesting about traveling this way. When people see a quiet older man boarding alone, they rarely see authority. They see someone ordinary, someone who can be overlooked, someone who probably won't complain. What they don't see is the history behind that seat. 40 years ago, I helped build the airline they were working for. Back then we had one aircraft, a borrowed office space, and a promise written in a small notebook. The promise was simple. Every passenger would be treated with dignity, not because they were wealthy, not because they were famous, but because respect should never depend on who someone appears to be. Over the decades, that small airline grew into something far larger than we ever imagined. Hundreds of aircraft crossing continents, thousands of employees, millions of passengers every year. From the outside, the company looked like a success story. But there is something most executives eventually forget. Growth can hide problems. Reports can be polished. Surveys can be filtered. But culture reveals itself somewhere far more honest. 35,000 feet above the ground, when employees believe no one important is watching. That's why every now and then, I take one of these flights without telling anyone who I am. No announcements. No recognition. Just another passenger sitting quietly in the front of the plane. Observing. Listening. Paying attention to the small things most people miss. Because the truth about a company doesn't appear in reports. It appears in moments. Small moments. Moments like the one that happened on that flight. Boarding that evening seemed perfectly routine. The cabin looked immaculate. Soft lighting washed over polished leather seats while flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisle greeting passengers. Everything appeared exactly the way a first-class experience should look. Professional. Elegant. Flawless. But as I stepped into the cabin and found seat 1A, something about the atmosphere felt slightly different. Not wrong. Just different. The kind of subtle tension most passengers would never notice. I placed my briefcase beside the seat, nodded politely to the flight attendant, and settled into place like any other traveler preparing for a quiet flight. Because the truth is, I hadn't boarded that flight simply to travel. I boarded to watch. And before the evening was over, the entire crew would discover exactly why. Before we begin this story, tell me where in the world you're watching from. Someone once told me this channel would never grow, but I believe powerful stories always find the people who need them. If you believe in stories about humility, respect, and quiet strength, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this story. Let's see how far this story can travel together. The aircraft pushed back from the gate exactly on schedule. Engines hummed softly beneath the cabin floor as the plane began its slow taxi toward the runway. Around me, the quiet luxury of first class settled into place. Passengers adjusted their seats. Laptop screens glowed faintly. A few people accepted glasses of champagne from the flight attendants moving gracefully through the aisle. Everything appeared polished, effortless. Exactly the way first-class service is designed to feel. One of the attendants approached my row with a practiced smile. "Good evening, sir. Can I offer you something to drink before takeoff?" "Sparkling water is fine," I replied. She nodded and moved on, placing drinks in front of several passengers before eventually returning with my glass. Nothing unusual, nothing remarkable, but I've learned something over the years. The smallest moments often reveal the most. After takeoff, the cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane climbed through the clouds. Once we leveled at cruising altitude, the service began. Hot towels were distributed. Menus followed shortly after. The man seated across the aisle from me received his first, then the woman behind him. Then the passenger 2 rows ahead. The attendant moved carefully down the aisle, handing each person a menu and explaining the meal options with enthusiasm. But when she reached my row, she passed me without stopping. I noticed it immediately, not because it was dramatic, but because it was subtle, the kind of small oversight most passengers would simply ignore. A few minutes later, another attendant began taking meal orders. "Sir, We have roasted salmon with lemon butter or a fillet with truffle potatoes tonight. The passenger beside me ordered the steak. Across the aisle, someone chose the salmon. Then the attendant looked briefly in my direction and continued walking. No menu. No question. No order taken. Just a quiet assumption that the man in seat 1A apparently didn't need dinner. I waited another 10 minutes. Sometimes mistakes happen. Sometimes crews are busy. But when the first meals began arriving, I noticed something else. Every passenger in first class had a tray placed in front of them. White linen cloths. Warm bread. Carefully plated entrees. Every passenger. Except me. The attendant returned to the aisle carrying another tray. As she placed it in front of the passenger behind me, I spoke calmly. "Excuse me." She turned politely. "Yes, sir. I believe my meal may have been missed." Her expression shifted slightly. Not rude, just dismissive. She glanced down at the service list in her hand, then back at me. "Oh, it appears the meals for first class have already been allocated." Allocated? An interesting word. "So there isn't one available?" I asked. She shook her head apologetically. "I'm afraid not, sir. But we do have snacks available if you'd like something lighter." Snacks. In first class. While every other passenger was being served a full dinner. For a moment, the passenger across the aisle looked up from his tray, then quickly returned to his meal. No one said anything. The cabin returned to its quiet rhythm of silverware clinking softly against plates. I leaned back in my seat. "Thank you," I said calmly. "That won't be necessary." The attendant nodded politely and continued down the aisle. From the outside, the moment seemed small, almost insignificant. A missed meal. A simple inconvenience during a long flight. But moments like these are rarely about food. They are about attention, about assumptions, about how easily service changes when someone appears unimportant. The rest of the cabin continued enjoying their dinners while I sat quietly beside an empty tray table. No complaint, no raised voice, just observation. Because the truth is, I had taken hundreds of flights over the years, and I had seen this pattern before. Service doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes slowly, in small decisions, quiet assumptions, moments when someone decides a passenger simply doesn't matter enough to notice. So I said nothing. I simply watched. Watched the service. Watched the crew. Watched how easily the evening continued as though nothing unusual had happened. And when the last tray was cleared away and the cabin lights dimmed for the remainder of the flight, I closed my eyes and waited patiently for the plane to land. Because by the time the aircraft touched the ground, something was about to happen that none of them were expecting. But long before this flight, before the polished cabins, the tailored uniforms, and the quiet confidence of a global airline, there had only been a small office, a rented desk, and a dream that many people believed would never leave the ground. 40 years earlier, the company that now stretched across continents had begun in a building most people would never notice. The office sat above a small travel agency on a narrow street near the airport. There was one desk, two mismatched chairs, a coffee machine that worked only when it felt like cooperating, and a window that rattled whenever planes took off in the distance. That was where the airline began. At the time, I wasn't a billionaire. I wasn't even close. I was simply a man with a background in aviation logistics and an idea most investors called unrealistic. Airlines were expensive, dangerously expensive. Aircraft leasing alone could destroy a company before it even carried its first passenger. The industry was dominated by giants, companies with deep pockets, political connections, and decades of experience. Starting a new airline wasn't just risky. It was reckless. At least that was what nearly every banker told me. I lost count of the number of offices where I sat across from someone in a dark suit who politely explained why the numbers didn't make sense. The margins are too thin. The startup costs are too high. The competition is too strong. One investor leaned back in his chair and said something I never forgot. "You don't build airlines anymore. You inherit them." But some ideas refuse to disappear simply because people doubt them. And I was stubborn enough to keep trying. The first breakthrough came in the form of a leased aircraft. Not a brand new jet with shining paint and flawless interiors. This one had already lived a long life. The seats were older. The overhead bins creaked when they closed, and the engine noise was louder than passengers preferred. But it flew, and at that moment, that was enough. One aircraft, one route, one chance. I wasn't alone in that tiny office. My wife, Eleanor, was there from the very beginning. She had no background in aviation, no training in airline management, but she possessed something far more valuable: perspective. While I spent my days studying flight schedules, maintenance costs, and regulatory paperwork, Eleanor paid attention to something different: people. She watched how passengers moved through airports, how they spoke to staff, how staff responded to them. She noticed small details others ignored. One evening, after we had been working late for the third night in a row, she placed a yellow legal notebook on the desk between us. "Before this grows," she said quietly, "we should decide what kind of company it's going to be." I remember smiling at the time. "We don't even have passengers yet." "That's exactly why it matters now," she replied. She opened the notebook and wrote a single sentence across the top of the page. The handwriting was steady and deliberate. "No passenger will ever be treated as if they don't matter." I stared at the sentence for a long moment. It was simple, almost obvious, but the longer I looked at it, the more I realized how rarely it was truly practiced. Air travel had already begun dividing passengers into categories: first class, business, economy, priority, non-priority, VIP, standard, and somewhere along the way, dignity had started to follow those labels. Eleanor closed the notebook and pushed it toward me. "That should be the rule," she said, "for everyone who works for us. And if they forget?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "Then the company forgets who it is." That sentence stayed with me, not just that evening, but every year that followed. The first months were brutal. Operating an airline meant solving problems most businesses never faced: aircraft maintenance schedules, crew certification requirements, fuel price fluctuations, airport slot negotiations. Every decision carried enormous financial consequences. Some weeks it felt as if we were building an airplane while already flying it. There were moments when I wondered if the investors had been right. Moments when the numbers refused to cooperate. Moments when I stared at spreadsheets late into the night wondering if the company would survive another month. But something unexpected happened once the first passengers began boarding our flights. They noticed the difference. Our aircraft weren't the newest. Our routes weren't the most glamorous. But the service was different. Flight attendants greeted passengers by name when possible. If someone looked nervous, they took a moment to reassure them. If a passenger had a problem, it was solved quietly and respectfully. Not because of a corporate script, because of a philosophy. Every new employee read Eleanor's sentence during training: "No passenger will ever be treated as if they don't matter." At first, it seemed almost too simple to matter. But culture often begins with the simplest ideas. Word spread. Passengers told friends. Business travelers began choosing our flights. Families booked vacations through us. Within a few years, one aircraft became 3, then 6, then 12. The tiny office above the travel agency became a headquarters building overlooking the runway. Routes expanded beyond domestic flights. International destinations followed. New aircraft joined the fleet. The airline grew faster than I had ever imagined possible. Thousands of employees, hundreds of aircraft, millions of passengers every year. On paper, it was a success story, the kind business magazines like to celebrate. But success carries its own quiet danger. Growth changes things. New managers join. Departments multiply. Policies become layered with procedures and reports. And somewhere inside that complexity, culture can begin to drift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, almost invisibly. That realization had started bothering me over the past few years. On the surface, the airline looked stronger than ever. Revenue records, international awards, customer satisfaction scores. Every report suggested things were running perfectly, but numbers have a way of hiding truth. Surveys can be influenced, reports can be filtered, and employees behave differently when they know leadership is watching. I had spent decades studying organizations, and one lesson had repeated itself in every industry. The true character of a company reveals itself when employees believe no one important is present. That was why I occasionally traveled the way I had tonight. No executive announcement, no assistance, no special treatment requested, just a boarding pass and a quiet seat. Most passengers on the aircraft would see an older man traveling alone. Nothing more, which meant the crew would behave naturally. Honestly, unfiltered. It was the only way to understand what the company had truly become. The aircraft hummed steadily as it continued its journey through the dark sky. Soft lighting glowed along the ceiling panels. Passengers shifted in their seats, some reading, some watching movies, some already asleep. I opened my eyes slowly. The cabin had settled into the quiet rhythm of long flights. A flight attendant walked down the aisle checking overhead bins. Another adjusted a blanket for a passenger 2 rows ahead. Professional. Efficient. But something still lingered in the atmosphere. That subtle feeling I had noticed earlier. Not disrespect. Not incompetence. Just a slight shift in tone. The kind of shift that happens when habits slowly replace values. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and removed a small leather notebook. It was similar to the one Eleanor had used all those years ago. Inside were only a few pages of notes. Dates. Flight numbers. Small observations written during trips like this. Nothing dramatic. Just details. Because details often reveal patterns. I wrote a short line beneath the current date. Service tone inconsistent. Observe further. Then I closed the notebook. Across the aisle, a businessman laughed quietly at something on his tablet. 2 rows behind me, a couple whispered while sharing a dessert. The cabin looked exactly the way a premium flight should look. Comfortable, elegant, effortless. But appearances can be deceiving, and leadership requires seeing beyond them. I leaned back into the seat. Seat 1A, the same place where thousands of passengers had sat before me. Some important, some ordinary, some remembered, most forgotten. But each one had deserved the same basic courtesy. Respect. That had been the promise from the very beginning. The promise written in a yellow notebook in a tiny office above a travel agency. A promise that had built an airline. Now the question was whether that promise still lived inside the company that had grown from it. Outside the window, the sky stretched endlessly dark, 35,000 feet above the earth. The perfect place to observe a company's true culture. Because up here, there are no executives walking the hallways. No supervisors standing nearby. Just employees doing their jobs the way they believe is normal. And tonight, I intended to watch carefully, quietly, patiently, because sometimes the most important leadership lessons arrive in the smallest moments. Moments most people would overlook. Moments that begin with something as simple as a meal service. I folded my hands, settled deeper into seat 1A, and allowed my attention to drift toward the activity in the aisle. The crew was beginning to prepare the galley again. Trays shifting, cartwheels locking into place, soft voices exchanging instructions. The next phase of the flight was about to begin. And as I watched them move through the cabin, the real observation was just getting started. The cabin had settled into the calm rhythm that often follows the first hour of flight. At 35,000 feet, the world outside the windows had disappeared into darkness, leaving only the soft glow of cabin lighting and the quiet hum of the engines beneath the floor. First class was designed to feel detached from everything else. The seats were wide, wrapped in soft leather the color of warm sand. Each one curved slightly inward, creating the illusion of privacy even in a shared space. Polished wooden panels ran along the sides of the cabin, reflecting the dim amber lighting above. Small reading lamps glowed like stars over each seat. The space carried an atmosphere of quiet exclusivity. Not loud wealth. Subtle wealth. The kind that whispers instead of announcing itself. Passengers spoke in softer voices here. Movements were slower, more relaxed. Even the air seemed calmer. Anderson Huffman sat quietly in seat 1A, his posture relaxed, a small book resting closed on the tray beside him. To anyone glancing his way, he appeared exactly as he intended. A quiet, older traveler. Nothing remarkable. Nothing important. Just another passenger enjoying the comfort of a long flight. But his eyes moved carefully around the cabin, observing everything. Because first class was more than a luxury compartment. It was a stage where service culture revealed itself in small, revealing ways. Across the aisle sat the first of the evening's personalities. A man in his early 40s wearing a dark tailored suit, the kind that suggested quiet success rather than flashy wealth. His silver laptop rested open on the wide armrest table, spreadsheets glowing softly on the screen. Every few minutes, he typed something quickly, paused, then leaned back as though calculating numbers in his head. The man had already introduced himself during boarding to the flight attendant with a confident smile. Marcus Langley, he had said, offering a polite nod. Consulting. I travel this route often. Frequent flyer. High-value passenger. The crew had responded exactly the way experienced airline staff often did. Warm recognition. A slightly brighter smile. Marcus had been offered sparkling water before the rest of the cabin finished boarding. A small gesture, but noticeable. 2 rows behind Anderson sat a young woman who seemed to exist in a completely different world. She couldn't have been older than 25. Her clothes were carefully chosen for comfort, but clearly expensive. A designer sweater draped loosely over her shoulders, and a sleek phone rested in her hand like a permanent accessory. Every few minutes, she angled the phone slightly upward, adjusting the lighting around her face before taking another photo, or perhaps a short video. Her voice carried softly through the cabin. Okay, so we're somewhere over the Atlantic right now. She paused to smile brightly at the screen. And this first-class experience is actually kind of amazing. Another short clip. Another quick edit. Then the phone lowered. A moment later it lifted again. Content creation in real time. The younger flight attendant had paused near her seat earlier with a friendly curiosity. Are you filming something special? She asked. The woman smiled instantly. Oh, just travel content. Well, if you need anything for the shot, the attendant replied lightly. Just let me know. The interaction lasted less than a minute, but the energy had been noticeably warm, engaging, almost enthusiastic. Across the aisle from the young influencer sat a retired couple who looked as though they had spent decades learning the quiet art of traveling together. The husband had a kind, weathered face and wore a simple navy sweater. A folded newspaper rested on his lap, though he hadn't turned the page in several minutes. His wife sat beside him reading a paperback novel, occasionally pausing to glance out the dark window. Their conversation came in soft, comfortable exchanges. Would you like some tea when they come around again? The husband asked gently. That would be nice, she replied. Chamomile. She smiled faintly. You always remember. They were the kind of passengers flight attendants often enjoyed serving. Polite, patient, grateful for small gestures. During boarding, the crew had helped place their luggage into the overhead compartment without being asked. One attendant had even brought them an extra blanket before takeoff. The couple thanked her warmly. Moments like that had once defined the airline's reputation. Quiet kindness. No audience required. Near the center of the cabin, the flight crew moved with practiced efficiency. The lead flight attendant, a woman named Caroline, carried herself with the calm authority of someone who had worked thousands of flights. Her posture was perfect. Her uniform pressed neatly. Every movement is deliberate. Caroline's eyes moved constantly, scanning the cabin the way experienced professionals often do. Not intrusive, but aware. She spoke softly to the younger attendant near the galley. Remember the special meal request in 2D? The younger attendant nodded quickly. Yes, of course. This younger attendant, whose name tag read Lena, seemed eager to perform every task perfectly. She moved quickly between seats, offering drinks, adjusting tray tables, responding to small requests. Her smile came easily, sometimes a little too easily, the kind that suggested someone still learning the rhythm of the job. Behind them, the cabin supervisor occasionally stepped into view, a taller man with a calm demeanor, monitoring the overall flow of the flight. He spoke rarely, but when he did, the crew listened. Together, they created the smooth choreography passengers expected from a premium flight. Glasses refilled before they were empty. Blankets offered before passengers asked. Soft words. Polite smiles. Professional efficiency. At first glance, the service appeared flawless. But Anderson had spent a lifetime studying people, and subtle differences often lived beneath polished surfaces. He watched carefully as Lena returned with a tray of drinks. Her first stop was Marcus Langley. Mr. Langley, would you care for another sparkling water? Marcus looked up briefly from his laptop. That would be great, thank you. The glass was replaced quickly. Next, she stopped by the young influencer's seat. Oh, are you filming again? Lena asked with friendly curiosity. The woman laughed. Just a quick update. Well, if you need anything at all, let me know. The tone was warm, engaged, almost conversational. Then Lena moved further down the aisle. The retired couple received gentle attention as well. Would you like that tea now, ma'am? She asked softly. That would be lovely, the woman replied. But when Lena reached Anderson's seat, something changed. Not dramatically, not rudely, just subtly. Her smile remained, but it was smaller, more mechanical. Can I get you anything, sir? The question came quickly, almost as if it were part of a checklist. Anderson looked up calmly. A glass of water would be perfect. Of course. The glass arrived moments later. The service was technically correct. But the warmth present in other interactions had softened slightly here. Barely noticeable, but noticeable enough. Anderson said nothing. He simply observed. Because leadership rarely reveals itself through dramatic mistakes. It reveals itself through small inconsistencies, the kind most people overlook. Time passed quietly. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight settled deeper into the night. Passengers adjusted their seats. Conversations faded into the low hum of engines. Somewhere behind the curtain, the galley became active again. Trays clinked softly. Metal drawers opened and closed. Low voices exchanged instructions. Anderson knew what was coming next. The most structured part of any premium flight. Meal service. From the galley, Lena carefully rolled out the first cart while Caroline inspected the setup. Everything needed to look effortless, even though the preparation required careful coordination. Plates were arranged. Cutlery aligned perfectly. Wine bottles placed at precise angles. Caroline adjusted one of the serving trays slightly. Presentation matters, she reminded quietly. Yes, of course, Lena replied. The cart moved forward. Passengers straightened in their seats as the soft anticipation of dinner spread through the cabin. For many travelers, this moment represented the height of first-class luxury. Restaurant-quality meals, elegant presentation, attentive service, an experience designed to feel refined and effortless. Anderson watched as the first linen cloths appeared, carefully folded, crisp and white. Lena began placing them gently across each tray table. The fabric unfolded smoothly, covering the polished surfaces beneath. One by one, row by row, the transformation was subtle but elegant. In moments, the cabin looked less like an aircraft and more like a quiet dining room floating high above the clouds. Anderson observed the ritual carefully, because rituals often reveal the true values of an organization. Attention to detail, consistency, respect for the passenger experience. The final cloth unfolded across a nearby tray. The cabin now looked ready, prepared, elegant. Anderson rested his hands calmly on the armrests of seat 1A as the attendants began preparing the first plates. Outside the window, the dark sky stretched endlessly in every direction. Inside the cabin, dinner service was about to begin. And as the carts rolled quietly forward through the aisle, white tablecloths unfolded across the cabin like quiet promises. The first plates left the galley with quiet precision. Lena pushed the service cart slowly down the aisle while Caroline walked a step ahead, offering warm introductions to the meal options of the evening. The polished routine had clearly been performed hundreds of times before. "Good evening, everyone," Caroline said with a professional warmth that carried easily through the cabin. "Tonight we'll be serving roasted Atlantic salmon with lemon butter, or a grilled filet with herb potatoes and seasonal vegetables." The passengers looked up with interest. The quiet hum of conversation returned as menus were discussed, preferences confirmed, and glasses refilled in preparation for the meal. The scent of warm bread followed the cart like a gentle announcement. Soft, comforting, familiar. Anderson watched the service begin with calm attention. From his seat in 1A, he had a clear view of the entire cabin. The choreography unfolded exactly as it should. Lena stopped beside Marcus Langley first. "Mr. Langley, would you prefer the salmon this evening or the filet?" Marcus glanced up from his laptop briefly. "The filet sounds perfect." "Excellent choice," she replied. The plate arrived moments later, arranged with the careful presentation expected in first class. The steak rested neatly beside roasted vegetables and a small portion of herb potatoes. Steam lifted faintly from the plate under the soft cabin lighting. Marcus gave a quick nod of appreciation. "Looks great. Enjoy your meal," Lena said warmly. The cart moved on. Next came the young influencer. "Oh wow," she said softly as Lena described the options again. "The salmon sounds amazing. We've had wonderful feedback about it," Lena replied with a smile. Moments later, the plate appeared in front of her. The young woman immediately lifted her phone. "Okay, this looks incredible," she murmured quietly while recording a short clip. Lena laughed lightly. "I hope it tastes as good as it looks." Further down the aisle, the retired couple received their meals with quiet gratitude. "Oh, this is lovely," the wife said gently. Her husband smiled. "You always make it look like a restaurant up here." Caroline inclined her head politely. "We're happy to hear that." The rhythm of service continued. Plates appeared. Bread baskets circulated. Wine glasses were topped off. The cabin gradually transformed into a quiet dining room high above the dark ocean below. Anderson observed every detail. Not critically, simply attentively. Because good service is often revealed through consistency. The way each passenger is approached. The tone used when describing the meal. The patience offered when someone asks questions. For several minutes, everything appeared exactly as it should. The cart rolled forward. Passengers began eating. The soft sounds of silverware touching porcelain joined the quiet hum of the engines. But then the cart reached the front row, and something changed. Lena stopped beside seat 1A. For a moment, she simply stood there. Her hands rested lightly on the edge of the cart. Her eyes flickered down briefly at the service list clipped near the handle, then back toward Anderson. The pause lasted only a second, 2 at most, but it was enough, because something in her expression shifted slightly. Not confusion, not exactly, more like hesitation. Anderson waited politely, assuming she would speak, but she didn't. Instead, Lena looked past him, then gently pushed the cart forward, past seat 1A, and continued down the aisle. The movement was smooth, almost natural, as if nothing unusual had happened. Caroline followed a moment later, continuing the service behind her. Another plate appeared for a passenger in the next row, then another, and another. Anderson blinked once. He glanced briefly toward the galley, then back at the cart, now moving further down the cabin. Perhaps they would return. Sometimes service required multiple passes, or perhaps his meal simply hadn't been plated yet. That happened occasionally. He rested his hands calmly on the armrests and waited. A minute passed, then another. Around him, the quiet sounds of dining grew stronger. The retired couple behind him began discussing the flavor of the vegetables. "This sauce is wonderful," the wife said softly. Marcus Langley had already cut into his steak. The young influencer took another photo before tasting her salmon. Anderson's tray table remained empty. He glanced down at the crisp white cloth spread neatly across it, perfectly arranged, ready for a meal that had not arrived. Still, he remained patient. Mistakes happen in any service environment. The true measure of professionalism is often how quickly those mistakes are corrected. Surely someone would notice soon. The cart would return. An apology would be offered. The meal would be delivered. Everything would resolve itself quietly. Another minute passed. Then 5. The service cart reached the far end of the cabin. Passengers were eating now. Most of the trays were full, wine glasses half empty, bread baskets nearly gone. Lena returned to the galley. Caroline checked briefly on a passenger near the window. Still, no one approached seat 1A. Anderson leaned back slightly in his seat. Not irritated, just thoughtful, because this was precisely the kind of moment he had learned to pay attention to over the years. Not dramatic mistakes, quiet ones. The kind that slipped through unnoticed. He observed Lena returning from the galley carrying another tray. But instead of coming forward again, she stopped beside a passenger in row 3. Dessert preparation, perhaps, or additional drinks. No one seemed aware that the front row remained untouched. Anderson glanced once more at the empty table before him. White cloth, polished cutlery, nothing else. The contrast was almost surreal. Every other passenger in the cabin was eating. Yet the very first seat in first class had been quietly skipped. Still, he said nothing. Another few minutes passed. Marcus Langley was halfway through his steak. The influencer had begun describing the meal into her phone again. "It's actually really good," she whispered. The retired couple spoke softly behind him. "You should try the potatoes," the husband suggested. "I will in a moment," his wife replied. The cabin felt warm. Content. Satisfied. Anderson remained the only passenger without a plate. Eventually, he glanced once more toward the galley, then toward Lena as she stepped back into the aisle. Their eyes met briefly. She looked away quickly and continued speaking with another passenger. That was when Anderson realized something important. No one had noticed. Not yet. In a room full of people enjoying dinner, the absence of one meal had gone entirely unobserved. He rested his hands calmly on the edge of the tray table. There was no need for frustration. No need for raised voices. Just a simple question. When Lena passed near his seat again, Anderson spoke gently. "Excuse me." She turned quickly, her professional smile returning. "Yes, sir." Anderson gestured lightly toward the empty tray table in front of him. "I believe my meal may have been missed." Lena's smile stayed in place, but it shifted slightly when she looked down at Anderson's empty tray table. For a brief moment, her eyes moved toward the service card as if confirming something already decided. "Oh," she said quickly. "I'm sorry, sir. It appears we ran out of your selection." The sentence was delivered smoothly. Polite. Practiced. But something about it felt strangely final. Anderson blinked once. "My selection?" he asked calmly. Lena nodded. "Yes, sir. Unfortunately, we no longer have any of the meals available." Anderson considered the words for a moment. "I don't recall selecting anything," he said gently. Her smile tightened, just slightly. "Well, the meals are limited, and we've already served the cabin." Her tone remained professional, but there was no follow-up, no pause, no suggestion, no attempt to solve the problem. She simply rested her hand briefly on the edge of the cart. "As I mentioned, sir, we no longer have anything available." Then she offered a short nod and stepped away. The exchange lasted less than 15 seconds. Short, efficient, finished. Anderson remained seated with his hands resting lightly on the armrests. For a moment, he simply watched Lena continue down the aisle. She stopped beside Marcus Langley's seat and asked warmly, "How is the filet this evening, Mr. Langley?" Marcus looked up and smiled. "It's excellent." "I'm glad to hear that," she replied brightly. "Would you like another glass of Cabernet?" "That would be great." Lena poured the wine carefully, filling the glass halfway before stepping back. "Enjoy the rest of your meal." A moment later, she moved toward the young influencer. "Is everything tasting all right?" "Oh my gosh, yes," the woman said. "This salmon is amazing." "I'm happy to hear that." Another warm smile. Another brief conversation. Anderson watched quietly, not with irritation, not with judgment, just attention. Because over the years he had learned that service culture rarely revealed itself through dramatic failures. It appeared in smaller ways. The tone of a voice. The patience offered to one person but not another. The subtle difference between how two passengers were treated within the same environment. He leaned back slightly in his seat. Across the cabin, the retired couple had nearly finished their meals. Caroline approached them with a small tray of fresh bread. "Would either of you care for another roll?" she asked kindly. The wife smiled. "That would be lovely, thank you." Caroline placed the bread gently on their table before topping off their water glasses. "Please let me know if there's anything else I can bring you." The husband nodded appreciatively. "Thank you." Meanwhile, Anderson's tray table remained untouched, still covered with the crisp white cloth, still holding the neatly aligned cutlery. But nothing else. No plate, no bread, not even a glass of water. The absence had become strangely visible now, like an empty space in a photograph that suddenly seemed impossible to ignore. Yet no one addressed it. The service continued around him. Dessert trays emerged from the galley. Small plates of chocolate mousse and fruit tarts appeared beside half-finished dinners. Coffee cups followed shortly afterward. Lena approached Marcus again. "Would you like coffee or espresso with dessert?" "Espresso sounds good." Moments later, the small cup arrived. The young influencer requested tea. The retired couple accepted coffee. Warm conversation followed each interaction. Soft laughter. Friendly questions. Polished hospitality. When Lena passed Anderson's row again, she didn't stop. She moved past smoothly, carrying a tray of desserts toward the next passenger. Anderson watched the motion quietly, then glanced down once more at the empty tray before him. He noticed something interesting. Even now, no one had acknowledged the situation again. Not Lena. Not Caroline. Not the supervisor who had briefly stepped through the cabin earlier. The problem had simply been closed. Filed away. Forgotten. Except for the person still sitting in seat 1A. Anderson folded his hands loosely together. Because this was the moment where most passengers would respond differently. Some would wave down an attendant again. Others would raise their voices, demand explanations, express frustration. And in many situations, that reaction would be completely understandable. But Anderson had learned something important during his years building the airline. The most revealing moments in leadership rarely occurred during conflict. They appeared during quiet observation, when people believed the situation had already ended, when they assumed no one was paying attention anymore. Across the aisle, the influencer took another photo of her dessert. "This is so pretty," she said softly. Marcus Langley closed his laptop and leaned back in his seat, finishing his espresso. The retired couple spoke quietly together, sharing their fruit tart. The cabin had become comfortable again, relaxed, satisfied. The missing meal had disappeared from everyone's awareness. Everyone except Anderson. He glanced toward the galley. For a moment, Lena stood just inside the curtain speaking quietly with another attendant. They both glanced briefly toward the cabin before continuing their conversation. Anderson couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to, because the behavior inside the cabin had already revealed something important. Not hostility, not open disrespect, nothing so obvious. Instead, something far more subtle. Assumption. He rested his elbow lightly on the armrest. Over the decades, Anderson had studied how organizations slowly change, not through large dramatic failures, but through tiny shifts in behavior. Moments where standards quietly lowered. Situations where employees made quick judgments about who deserved their full attention and who did not. Most of the time, those decisions happened unconsciously. A quick glance, a silent impression, a guess about someone's importance, and then behavior adjusted accordingly. The passenger who looked influential received extra care. The passenger who appeared ordinary received basic service. And the passenger who seemed unimportant sometimes received even less. None of it required bad intentions, just assumptions. And assumptions could reshape an entire culture if they were left unchallenged. Anderson turned his attention once more to the empty tray table before him, then slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. From it, he removed a small black notebook. The cover was worn slightly at the edges. It had traveled with him on hundreds of flights over the years. He opened it carefully. Several pages were already filled with neat handwriting from earlier observations. He turned to a fresh page. For a moment, he simply looked at the blank paper. Then he picked up the small pen clipped inside the notebook. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the crew prepared the aircraft for the quieter portion of the flight. Passengers leaned back into their seats. Some continued talking softly. Others opened laptops or watched movies. The evening was settling into its long rhythm above the clouds. Anderson lowered the pen to the page. He wrote a single line, then closed the notebook and placed it quietly back into his jacket pocket. The notebook rested once again inside Anderson's jacket. From the outside, nothing about his posture suggested anything unusual had happened. He remained seated calmly in seat 1A, the white tablecloth still stretched neatly across the tray before him. Empty. Around him, the first-class cabin continued its quiet rhythm. The gentle clinking of silverware. Soft conversations drifting between rows. The faint hum of engines beyond the insulated walls of the aircraft. For most passengers, the evening had settled comfortably into routine. Dinner had been served. Dessert had followed. Coffee cups now rested beside half-finished plates. Everything appeared polished, orderly, professional. Yet Anderson had spent far too many years building organizations to judge a system only by what appeared on the surface. Because the most revealing moments in any institution were rarely dramatic. They were quiet, and they appeared when people believed no one influential was paying attention. He had learned that lesson decades earlier, long before the airline grew into the global company it had become. Back then, the lessons had come through trial and error, through mistakes, through observing how employees behaved when leadership was absent, or when leadership was present but unrecognized. The difference between those two situations could be enormous. Anderson rested his hands lightly on the armrests and allowed his gaze to drift across the cabin. Marcus Langley leaned comfortably back in his seat, finishing the final sip of his espresso. The empty cup sat beside a polished dessert plate where a small chocolate mousse had been only minutes earlier. Across the aisle, the young influencer was scrolling through her phone again. She tilted the screen slightly toward the cabin lights, examining a photo she had just taken. "This one looks better," she murmured quietly to herself. The retired couple were finishing their coffee. The husband carefully folded his napkin before setting it beside his empty plate. His wife smiled warmly at Caroline as she passed. "Everything was wonderful," the woman said. "I'm very glad you enjoyed it," Caroline replied politely. She reached forward and gently removed their plates from the table. "Can I offer you anything else this evening?" The couple shook their heads. "No, thank you." Caroline nodded and moved on. The service continued smoothly, the routine of hospitality unfolding exactly as it should, except for one small detail. Seat 1A remained untouched. Anderson's tray table still carried the white linen cloth. The utensils placed earlier remained perfectly aligned. But nothing had ever been served. No dinner, no dessert, no coffee. No one had returned to ask again. Anderson wasn't offended, not in the way most people might assume. What he felt instead was something closer to curiosity, because over the years, he had come to understand something important about human behavior. The most honest behavior appears when people believe no one important is watching. When staff know they are being evaluated, they perform differently. Procedures are followed perfectly. Smiles become slightly brighter. Attention becomes slightly sharper. But when that awareness disappears, people revert to instinct, to assumption, to habit. And habit was the truest reflection of culture. That was why Anderson occasionally traveled the way he had tonight. Quietly, unannounced, invisible. No corporate notice, no executive escort, just a passenger with a ticket. Because that was the only way to see the airline the way millions of customers experienced it every year. He turned his head slightly toward the galley. Through the partially drawn curtain, he could see Lena speaking softly with another crew member. Their conversation looked relaxed now, unhurried. The intense pace of dinner service had passed. For the moment, the cabin required little attention. Anderson shifted his gaze back toward the passengers. The influencer briefly glanced up from her phone. For a moment, her eyes fell on the empty space in front of Anderson. The untouched tray, the clean tablecloth. Her expression paused for a second. Then she looked away again. A few minutes later, Marcus Langley also noticed. He leaned slightly toward the aisle, his eyes drifting toward Anderson's seat. The observation lasted barely a second. Then Marcus returned his attention to his laptop. No one said anything. No one called a flight attendant. No one pointed out the obvious absence. Not out of cruelty, not out of indifference, but because silence often spreads easily in environments like this. Passengers rarely want to involve themselves in situations that might create discomfort. Anderson understood that too. Human nature preferred calm, preferred avoiding conflict, especially at 35,000 feet. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the crew prepared the aircraft for the quieter portion of the flight. Several passengers adjusted their seats into a more relaxed position. A few closed their eyes. Others opened movies on their screens. Lena stepped out from the galley, once more carrying a tray of coffee cups. She moved down the aisle, offering them to several passengers who had not yet received one. "Coffee, sir." "Yes, thank you." "And for you, ma'am?" "That would be lovely." The tray moved slowly row by row. Anderson watched the motion quietly. When Lena approached the retired couple again, she paused politely. "Would either of you care for another cup?" "No, thank you," the husband replied kindly. She nodded and continued forward. For a moment it appeared she might stop at Anderson's seat, but her eyes moved briefly across the empty tray before him, then continued toward the next passenger. The moment passed without acknowledgement. The tray of coffee cups moved farther down the cabin. Anderson leaned back slightly. He wasn't surprised. Not anymore. Because by now the pattern had become clear. The first oversight could have been accidental, but the repeated absence of follow-up revealed something deeper. Something quieter. A decision. An assumption. Not spoken aloud, but understood through behavior. Anderson had seen it happen in organizations before. One small moment where a staff member made a quick judgment about a customer. Maybe about their appearance, their attitude, their perceived importance. And from that point forward, every interaction was subtly shaped by that judgment. The customer who seemed powerful received careful attention. The one who seemed ordinary received standard service. And the one who seemed unimportant sometimes faded into the background entirely. It was rarely intentional, rarely malicious, just human instinct. But instinct, left unexamined, could slowly reshape an entire culture. Anderson closed his eyes briefly. Not in frustration, but in reflection. 40 years earlier, when he and his partners started the airline, they had written a single sentence in a small notebook. A sentence that guided every early decision they made. Every passenger deserves dignity. Not because of wealth, not because of influence, but because dignity should never require qualification. For many years, that principle had shaped the company's culture. It had guided training, hiring, leadership decisions. But large organizations had a way of drifting over time. New employees arrived. Old lessons faded. Procedures replaced principles. And sometimes the original purpose quietly slipped out of view. That was why Anderson took flights like this. To see the airline as it truly existed. Not in reports. Not in boardroom presentations. But in moments like this. 35,000 feet above the ground. Where the smallest decisions revealed the largest truths. The aircraft shifted slightly as it passed through a thin layer of clouds. The seatbelt sign chimed softly overhead. A few passengers glanced up. Moments later, the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened and that your seats are returned to the upright position." The announcement faded into the quiet hum of the engines. Passengers began adjusting their seats. Tray tables were folded away. Laptops closed. Phones checked for signal. The routine of arrival had begun. Anderson slowly lifted the untouched linen cloth from his tray table and folded it neatly. Then he placed it carefully back on the surface. His hands rested calmly in his lap. Because by the time the aircraft reached the ground, the quiet observations of this flight were about to become something else entirely. The captain's announcement faded, leaving the cabin wrapped once again in the soft, constant hum of the engines. Around Anderson, the quiet choreography of arrival began. Seatbacks rose. Tray tables clicked into place. Laptop screens dimmed as passengers closed their devices and slid them into leather bags and briefcases. The young influencer across the aisle finished recording one final clip for her followers. "We're about to land," she said softly into her phone, adjusting the camera angle slightly. "First class was amazing tonight." She smiled toward the screen. Then the recording ended. A moment later, she reached for the overhead compartment. Marcus Langley had already closed his laptop and was reviewing a document on his tablet. The retired couple spoke quietly to each other, the wife folding a scarf carefully into her purse. Everything about the cabin suggested an ordinary flight nearing its end. No raised voices, no visible conflict, no complaints. And yet, to Anderson, the evening had revealed far more than the crew likely realized. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and removed the small notebook again. The same notebook he had carried with him on dozens of flights over the years. It wasn't large, just a compact leather-bound pad with cream-colored pages. Inside were observations collected over time. Moments, details, patterns, not accusations, not complaints, just quiet records of what truly happened when leadership wasn't visible. Anderson opened the notebook to a blank page. For a moment, he simply looked at the paper. The cabin lights reflected faintly across the smooth surface. He held the pen loosely between his fingers. Then he began writing. The first line appeared slowly. "Service influenced by perceived status." He paused, not because the thought was difficult, but because he wanted the words to remain precise. Over the course of 40 years, Anderson had learned something essential about leadership. Emotion clouded clarity, and clarity was what created improvement. So he wrote carefully. Not angrily, not dramatically, simply documenting what he had witnessed. He continued. Initial service attention directed toward visibly affluent passengers. His eyes moved briefly across the cabin. Marcus Langley, perfectly tailored suit, confident posture, the sort of traveler that crew members instinctively recognized as important. The influencer, youthful, stylish, the kind of passenger who often carried influence in a different way. Both had received attentive service, warm conversation, immediate follow-up. That wasn't inherently wrong. Attentive service was the goal. The problem appeared when attention became selective. Anderson wrote again. Inconsistent service distribution within the same cabin class. He paused again. The pen hovered slightly above the page. Because the missing meal itself had never been the most important detail. Mistakes happened. They always would. Airlines operated in an environment filled with complexity. Hundreds of passengers. Tight schedules. Limited resources on board. Even the best crews occasionally made errors. What defined professionalism wasn't the absence of mistakes. It was how those mistakes were handled afterward. And tonight, that was where the deeper issue had appeared. Anderson wrote another line. No recovery effort after service error identified. His memory replayed the moment calmly. When he had spoken politely. "Excuse me, I believe my meal may have been missed." The attendant's response had been brief. Final. "We ran out of your selection. No apology. No alternative. No follow-up." Even a small gesture would have changed the entire experience. A simple explanation. A replacement meal from another cabin. Even a sincere apology offered with warmth. But none of those things had happened. Instead, the moment had simply closed. The crew had moved forward with the remainder of the service. Anderson's tray had remained empty. The pen moved again. Observation. Assumption appears to have influenced service priority. He stopped writing for a moment and leaned back slightly in his seat. His eyes drifted across the dim cabin. Passengers were now fastening their seatbelts. Overhead lights glowed softly above each row. Outside the windows, the darkness of the sky had begun to fade slightly as the aircraft descended toward the city below. Anderson closed the notebook briefly, resting on his lap. He wasn't angry, not even slightly. Anger had never been a particularly useful leadership tool. It created fear, and fear rarely produced genuine improvement. What he felt instead was something quieter. Disappointment, because he remembered the early days of the airline, when every employee understood the mission clearly, when the promise written in that small notebook decades earlier guided every interaction. No passenger will ever be treated as if they don't matter. Back then, crews would have noticed immediately if someone had been overlooked. They would have corrected the situation instantly, not out of fear of punishment, but out of pride in their work, out of respect for the passenger, and for the company they represented. Anderson reopened the notebook. One final section remained. He turned the page slightly and wrote a short heading, Cultural Indicators. Then he listed the observations beneath it. 1. Service warmth varied by passenger perception. 2. Oversight not acknowledged once identified. 3. No corrective action initiated by crew. 4. Fellow passengers noticed inconsistency but remained silent. He looked at the list for a moment. Not a disaster, not a crisis, just small cracks, the kind that appear slowly over time. Cracks that, if ignored long enough, could reshape an entire culture. Anderson closed the notebook gently. The leather cover made a soft sound as it pressed against the pages. He slipped it back into his jacket pocket. Across the aisle, the influencer glanced briefly toward him again. Her eyes fell once more on the empty space where a meal tray should have been earlier. This time her expression lingered slightly longer, almost as if she was trying to decide whether to say something. But the moment passed. She turned back toward the window instead. Marcus Langley adjusted his seatbelt. The retired couple folded their hands quietly in their laps. The aircraft tilted slightly as it descended through another layer of clouds. Outside the windows, the scattered lights of the city appeared below like small constellations spread across the ground. The cabin lights dimmed even further. The soft chime of the seatbelt sign echoed gently overhead. Anderson rested his hands calmly on the armrests. Everything he needed to understand about the evening had already happened. The final step simply hadn't arrived yet, but it would soon, because in just a few minutes, the aircraft would touch the runway. Passengers would stand. Overhead bins would open. People would gather their belongings and hurry toward their next destination. And in that moment, something quiet but significant would occur. The aircraft descended steadily. The ground grew closer. A faint vibration moved through the cabin as the landing gear deployed. Then came the familiar moment. The gentle impact of wheels meeting runway. A low roar of reverse thrust followed as the aircraft slowed along the dark strip of pavement. Passengers relaxed slightly in their seats. Phones reappeared in hands. Messages began to load. The routine of arrival had begun. But Anderson Huffman remained perfectly still, because for him, the real moment of this flight had only just arrived. The aircraft slowed steadily as it rolled along the runway. Outside the window, airport lights streaked softly across the glass, long ribbons of gold and white sliding through the darkness. Inside the cabin, a familiar energy returned. Seatbelts unfastened with quick metallic clicks. Phones lit up in hands across the rows as signals reconnected. Messages arrived. Voices returned. The quiet discipline of flight dissolved into the casual rhythm of arrival. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome," the captain's voice announced over the speakers. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the aircraft has reached the gate and the seatbelt sign has been switched off." The engines softened as the plane taxied slowly across the tarmac. Anderson Huffman remained exactly where he was. Seat 1A, hands resting calmly on the armrests. His expression unchanged. Around him, the other passengers were already gathering their belongings. Marcus Langley slipped his tablet into a slim leather case and stood the moment the seatbelt sign chimed off. The influencer across the aisle lifted her phone again, recording the familiar closing moment of travel. "We've just landed," she whispered toward the camera with a small smile. The retired couple rose slowly, carefully retrieving their coats from the overhead compartment. The lead flight attendant, Caroline, moved gracefully down the aisle with the practiced confidence of someone who had completed this routine hundreds of times. "Thank you for flying with us this evening," she said warmly to each passenger. Marcus stepped forward first, nodding politely as he passed her. "Pleasure as always," he said. "We hope to see you again soon, Mr. Langley," Caroline replied with the same smooth professionalism she had displayed throughout the flight. The influencer followed shortly after. "Good night," she said brightly. "Have a wonderful evening," Caroline responded. One by one, the first-class passengers stepped into the aisle and moved toward the exit door at the front of the aircraft. Luggage wheels rolled softly across the carpet. Voices drifted toward the open cabin door. Within a few minutes, the once full first-class cabin had grown quiet. The rows that had been occupied moments earlier now sat empty. Only one passenger remained seated, Anderson Huffman. Caroline noticed him then. For a brief moment, surprise flickered across her face. Most passengers in first class were among the first to leave the aircraft. It was unusual for someone in seat 1A to remain behind. She stepped forward politely. "Sir," she said with a professional smile, "we've arrived at the gate." Anderson looked up calmly. "Yes," he replied gently. "I noticed." Caroline waited a moment. "Is there something I can assist you with?" Anderson paused for just a second before speaking. His tone remained calm, unhurried. "Actually," he said, "there is a small favor I'd like to request." Caroline straightened slightly. "Of course." Anderson gestured lightly toward the front of the cabin. "Would it be possible for the captain and the cabin crew to remain on board for a brief moment?" Caroline blinked. The request was unusual. Passengers sometimes asked questions after flights. Sometimes they reported concerns. But asking for the entire crew to remain behind was not something she heard often. Still, there was something about the way Anderson spoke. Calm, measured, not confrontational, just certain. "May I ask what this is regarding?" she said carefully. Anderson offered a small, polite smile. "It won't take long," he replied. "I promise." Caroline hesitated for a moment. Then she nodded. "Very well, sir." She stepped toward the galley and spoke quietly with Lena and the cabin supervisor. A few minutes later, the captain appeared at the front of the cabin. He was a tall man with calm eyes and the relaxed authority of someone who had spent decades in the cockpit. "Good evening," he said politely as he approached. Caroline gestured toward Anderson. This passenger requested a moment with the crew. The captain nodded and turned toward Anderson. "Is there a concern I can assist you with, sir?" Anderson stood slowly from his seat. Not hurried, not tense, just deliberate. He reached down and picked up the small leather briefcase resting beside his seat. The cabin remained quiet. Caroline stood nearby. Lena watched from the galley entrance. The cabin supervisor folded her hands politely. Anderson opened the briefcase and removed a small wallet. From it, he withdrew a simple identification card. He stepped forward and handed it calmly to the captain. "Before we continue," Anderson said softly, "I think it would be helpful if you saw this." The captain accepted the card without suspicion. At first, his expression remained neutral. Then his eyes focused on the name printed across the top. And everything changed. He looked at the card again, more carefully this time, then back at Anderson, then once more at the card. His posture shifted instantly. The relaxed stance he had carried into the cabin straightened almost unconsciously. Caroline noticed the change immediately. "Captain," she said quietly. But he didn't answer. His eyes were still on the card. Because the name printed there was unmistakable. Anderson Huffman, founder, chairman, majority owner of the airline. The man standing in front of them wasn't simply a passenger. He was the man who had built the company they worked for. The captain slowly lowered the card. His eyes met Anderson's. For a moment, no one spoke. Caroline's expression changed as realization slowly reached her. Her eyes widened slightly. Lena looked between them, confused. "What?" she began softly. The captain handed the card back carefully. "Mr. Huffman," he said quietly. The name fell into the cabin like a stone into still water. Caroline's breath caught. Her eyes moved quickly between Anderson and the captain. The pieces connected all at once. The quiet passenger. Seat 1A. The man who had remained silent the entire flight. The man whose tray had remained empty. Anderson Huffman. Founder. Chairman. Owner. The cabin suddenly felt much smaller. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence spread across the space like a sudden drop in altitude. Anderson accepted the identification card and placed it calmly back inside his wallet. He looked at each member of the crew in turn. Not angrily, not accusingly, simply steadily. Caroline's face had lost its color. Lena stood completely still near the galley. The cabin supervisor's posture had become rigid. Anderson rested his hands lightly on the back of the seat beside him. "I appreciate you taking a moment to remain on board," he said calmly. No one responded, because at that moment, every single person in the cabin had realized the same thing. The quiet passenger they had served that evening was the man who owned the airline, and the truth of the flight was about to become impossible to ignore. For several seconds after the captain read the card, no one spoke. The cabin, once filled with the ordinary sounds of passengers gathering bags and preparing to leave, had fallen into a strange and uncomfortable silence. The lead flight attendant stood frozen beside Anderson's seat. Her polite professional smile had disappeared, replaced by something far more human: confusion, disbelief, and slowly, the realization of what the name on that card truly meant. The captain looked up from the identification and studied the man sitting calmly in seat 3A. There was no anger in Anderson Huffman's face. No triumph, no satisfaction, just the same quiet composure he had carried throughout the entire flight. The captain straightened instinctively. "Mr. Huffman," he said carefully. The tone of his voice had changed completely. Moments earlier, Anderson had simply been another passenger, one of hundreds passing through the airline system each day. Now the weight of the moment was settling across the cabin. The captain cleared his throat. "Sir, I apologize if anything during this flight." Anderson gently raised his hand. Not sharply, not dismissively, just enough to pause the sentence before it finished. "This isn't about a meal," Anderson said softly. His voice was calm, steady, and thoughtful. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. The lead attendant's hands tightened slightly around the service card handle. Anderson leaned back slightly in his seat. "For 40 years, he continued, I've been asked the same question by investors, journalists, and new employees." He paused, allowing the quiet cabin to hold the words. "They ask what makes an airline successful." No one interrupted. Anderson folded his hands. "Some believe it's the aircraft." He glanced briefly toward the windows, where the wings stretched across the fading light of the runway. "Some say it's pricing, technology, route networks." His eyes moved slowly across the crew, standing nearby. "And many assume it's luxury." The lead attendant lowered her gaze. But Anderson shook his head gently. "They're all wrong." The words weren't harsh, but they carried weight. "The truth," Anderson said, "is much simpler." He paused again. An airline succeeds or fails based on something far less visible. The captain listened carefully now. Anderson's voice lowered slightly. "Respect." The words settled in the quiet space like a stone dropped in still water. Anderson reached for the small notebook that had rested beside him throughout the flight. He flipped it open. Several pages now held careful handwritten observations. He didn't read them out loud, but he turned the notebook so the captain could see the words written across the page. The captain's eyes moved slowly down the list. Wine service skipped. Meal explanation unclear. No replacement offered. Dessert not served. Coffee service bypassed. Passenger acknowledgement minimal. Each line was short, precise, neutral, not accusations, observations. Anderson closed the notebook. "You see," he said calmly, "what happened today wasn't dramatic." He gestured gently toward the now empty cabin. There was no argument, No raised voices. No obvious conflict. The lead attendant swallowed quietly. Anderson looked directly at her, not with anger, but with steady honesty. "What happened today," he said, "was something far more common." The captain already understood. "Assumption," Anderson continued. The word was soft, but unmistakable. He folded his notebook closed again. "You assumed who I was." The lead attendant's face flushed. Anderson didn't allow the moment to turn cruel. He continued calmly. "And once that assumption formed, every decision after it followed quietly." He glanced toward the aisle. Service became shorter. Attention became lighter. And eventually, he paused. "I simply stopped being seen." The words hung heavily in the air. No one argued, because everyone in that moment knew he was right. Anderson sighed softly, not in frustration, but in reflection. "When I started this airline," he said, "I made one promise." The captain leaned slightly closer. "Every passenger matters." Anderson's voice strengthened just slightly. "Not the loudest passenger. Not the richest passenger. Not the passenger who looks important." His eyes moved across the small group standing before him. The quiet ones. The tired ones. The ones who sit politely and ask for nothing. He tapped the armrest lightly. "Those passengers are the real test." No one spoke. The cabin lights glowed softly above them. The world outside the aircraft continued moving normally. Ground crews working, luggage carts passing, engines humming in the distance. But inside the cabin, time felt paused. Anderson's voice softened again. "I didn't stay seated to embarrass anyone." The lead attendant finally looked up. He offered a small, reassuring nod. "I stayed," he said, "because moments like this are opportunities." The captain exhaled slowly. Anderson continued. "This airline was built on dignity." He gestured lightly toward the empty seats around them. "True luxury isn't leather seats. It isn't champagne. It isn't gourmet meals." He let the thought finish slowly. "True luxury is dignity." The lead attendant blinked quickly, holding back emotion. Anderson stood from his seat. The movement was simple, unceremonious, but it carried authority that didn't need to be displayed loudly. The captain instinctively stepped slightly aside as Anderson moved into the aisle. For a moment, they simply stood facing one another. Then Anderson extended his hand. The captain shook it firmly. "Thank you for flying today," the captain said quietly. Anderson smiled faintly. "I always do." A small pause passed. Then Anderson added one final thought. "Just remember something." The captain nodded. Anderson glanced once more across the quiet cabin. His voice was calm, steady, and unforgettable. "An airline is not defined by its fleet." He paused. "Its profits." Another pause. "Or its luxury cabins." He looked directly at the crew. "It is defined by how the quietest passenger is treated when no one believes he matters." The words settled deeply into the room. Anderson picked up his notebook. Then, without another speech, without drama, and without needing recognition, he walked down the aisle. Just another passenger leaving the aircraft. Later that evening, in a quiet executive office overlooking the city lights, Anderson sat at his desk reviewing the day's reports. The flight number appeared near the top of the page. He read through the service logs, the crew notes, the incident summary. He closed the file gently. Across the company, changes would begin quietly. Not punishments, improvements, new training sessions, reinforced service standards, a renewed focus on the principle that had built the airline from the beginning. Respect. Policies would be updated. Managers would review procedures. But the most important lesson had already been delivered. Not in a boardroom, not in a memo, but at 35,000 feet. Anderson leaned back slightly in his chair. The same small notebook rested beside him. He opened it one last time and wrote a single sentence beneath the day's observations. Then he closed it. Outside, aircraft lights crossed the night sky, each flight carrying passengers whose stories no one yet knew. Anderson watched the distant lights for a moment, because he knew something many people forgot. Every quiet passenger mattered, and the future of an airline depended on remembering that. An airline is not defined by its fleet, its profits, or its luxury cabins. It is defined by how the quietest passenger is treated when no one believes he matters.